Welcome to Fundamental Freedoms. My name's Steve Burgess, and I'm broadcasting from my home in St. George, Utah.
And I'm David Sabine, and I'm broadcasting from my home in Ontario.
We're grateful to have you with us at Fundamental Freedoms. We're out to prove three basic tenets. One is it is okay to enter a conversation not prepared to win. It is okay to change your mind, and it is absolutely okay to have a lot of respect for people, even those whom you disagree with. And that's what we're all about here, is having good conversations to build good society.
And if you like what we do here, please connect with us at fundamentalfreedoms.locals.com. It's just a great platform where we can have some conversation about the videos that we upload and about the guests that we have. Some of our guests are members there as well, so you could speak directly with them. Also push the like and subscribe button so you can be notified when Steve and I go live. We don't really have a schedule for this. We do it ad hoc, so be sure to click that button and be notified.
Well, we're really excited. Tonight we're going to be speaking with Bryan Hyde of the Bryan Hyde Show. And with that, let's go ahead and bring him on. Hello, Bryan.
Hello there.
Well, we're grateful to have you joining us. You're up there on the big screen. I'm going to be watching you through my monitor up here, so I don't get too much of a crank in my neck. But welcome. Bryan, we'd like you to take a moment and tell us about what you do at the Bryan Hyde Show. Maybe a little bit about how you came to be where you are at right now.
Okay. I revel in wrongthink. At least that's my unofficial slogan for the Bryan Hyde Show. But ideally what I'm trying to do is help people question the narratives around them, to seek after truth, and to be open to ideas that help them better understand the world, but more importantly, help them understand the impact that they can have, even if it's in what they may consider limited ways. I'm convinced that all of us are a lot less helpless than we think we are, or than we're told we are.
Thanks. Appreciate that. Well, let's go ahead and get started. Mm-hmm. We'll share with you our rules. We have two rules on fundamental freedoms. Number one is no unidentified theys. So we kind of leave that up to the honor system. We'll call each other out if we start talking about they this or they that. It's important. We want to make sure we're identifying exactly who or what group we're talking about. Rule number two is each of us are representing ourselves individually. We're not speaking or proposing or assuming to speak on anyone or any group's behalf. With that, the way that we kind of kick things off is we'll pose to you two fundamental questions. David and I are not experts in anything. We haven't spent hours studying you or your background, and so we're trying to mimic as much as possible a normal human conversation. And so we have what we call our fundamental questions. I'll pose mine, David will pose his, and we'll spend the rest of the time maybe trying to unpack and get to a great answer on those two questions. So I'll go ahead and start. A little bit of background. So Thursday, on Thanksgiving Day, I had a couple of minutes to kill and got on my phone, and I was browsing AIER, the American Institute for Economic Research, which I know you're familiar with and cite on your show sometimes. Anyway, I came across an article, and the article really scratched my back. It kind of was the narrative that I would choose to believe, or that I would like to believe is going on in this particular element. And so I read through it, and it was basically a rehashing or kind of a synopsis of a study that was done by a pretty prominent professor at a prominent university. And so I got to reading through the article, I got to the end of it, and I thought, that's scratching my back too much. That's making me feel too good about reality. I'm going to go and dive a little deeper, do my own research, and what is this article about, and Googled, and found I couldn't find the article. And then I thought, well, I know it's the November issue of this notable university's newsletter. So I went and found that issue and read through it, and there's no article. The article they were citing just isn't there. And got all the way down to the bottom, and there was a couple of tweets that they had republished or whatever, added to the discussion on their thing, and it said, this article, and it named the article I was looking for, has been removed. And then the other tweet was, we apologize for spreading COVID misinformation, and this article was in error, etc. And so I thought, oh, okay, well, it looks like it's been discredited or whatever. And then immediately my thought was, because I liked that narrative, and so I thought, oh, the man got them. Twitter came down and applied some pressure to the university. The university applied pressure to their professor, pulled it down, apologized. And then I thought, I don't know if that's the case. And now I'm not really sure what to believe, because we've got CDC information that said this, and then this article or the study that said something completely different. And I thought, the author of this article owes me a better explanation, because, what am I going to do with this? And so I actually emailed him, the author, which I had no idea who he was, and sent an email and said, do you know anything about this discrediting or what's going on here? And about half an hour later, on Thanksgiving Day, got an email back from the author of the article, which I was surprised about. And
that's impressive.
Yeah, explained what I had found, and he then got back to me again, said, hey, really like to know details, send me some links. So I put together an email for him, and haven't heard back. Don't have the full resolution yet, but anyway, I was impressed with the access that I had to that media. I was going there looking for information, got some information that I liked or thought I liked, found some issues, and was able to actually talk to the newscaster, to the journalist, essentially. So that was great, but it was a little bit chaotic, and it was a little bit of work, and I don't know that everybody has time or an incline to do that much work and research. So I know that we don't want Pravda in the United States. We don't want a state-sponsored media. But I often hear people hearkening back to the days of Walter Cronkite on CBS, and when he closed his newscast and said that is the way that it was believed that that was the way that it is, and everybody kind of got their news from that one source, and there was the public discussion had a certain amount of congruity because of that. I think, I don't know, I wasn't alive, I guess, at that time, and so maybe it wasn't as congruent as I think. Anyway, with all of that as preface, my fundamental question is there a need or a place for an authoritative source of news? Do we need to work to find or to build or to support an authoritative source of news apart from the podcasting and the Rush Limbaugh? Maybe he was kind of one of the pioneers of that. But anyway, stew on that. David, let's give you an opportunity to ask yours, and we'll go from there.
Sure. So Bryan, I know you're dying to jump in and answer Steve's comments there. The way that it works here is that we want these two fundamental questions out there for the whole discussion as a frame. So, and by the way, it's really nice to finally meet you. We've been in correspondence a little bit to set this up.
Likewise.
I know that it was Steve that actually reached out to you first, and I'm really glad that he did, and it's nice to have you with us. My fundamental question is it's related in a way to what Steve had said, and I'm very interested to know. So I believe that media is corrupt. Most media networks and broadcast platforms are corrupt or have a tendency toward corruption, and we're probably well on the way through that spectrum already. And I've wondered if, and I know you're involved heavily with podcasting and various other outlets, blogging and such. I've wondered if the potential of, let's call it amateur media or amateur broadcasting, and the word amateur there is not meant in a derogatory way at all. It's really just meant to be sort of independent and without all the pomp and circumstance of conventional broadcasting. But is the vast network of independent amateur podcasters and bloggers and video conversations susceptible to the same kinds of corruption, or not? Like, is there something inherent in the internet and our ability to publish video and audio and text as amateurs and as independents? Is there something inherent in that will prevent the same kinds of corruption that has occurred in, let's call it, mainstream media? I'd really like to flesh that out with you and get your perspective on that throughout our conversation.
These are both excellent fundamental questions, and it's wonderful that they dovetail together nicely as well. In answer to Steve's question, my first answer would be no, I don't think we need an authoritative source. Instead, I would put it back on each of us needs to become an authoritative sorter of fact from fiction. And that's, we have to propaganda proof ourselves. And there were a couple of names that popped into my head as you were, explaining the preface to your question. One of them is Edward Bernays. And I'm just curious if either of you have heard that name. I see David nodding.
Name. I'm not familiar, though.
I have, Edward, and as soon as you mention it, I know it'll all come rushing back.
Yeah, Edward Bernays literally wrote the book on propaganda.
Yes.
And he lived in the early 20th century. And, the thing that you have to remember is we say the word propaganda like, oh, it's, that's a terrible thing. And that's, that's what the Nazis did to their people. They propagandized them. That's what the Russians did. That's what the, North Koreans do. And that's true. But there is such a thing as good propaganda. And I'll give you an example of it. I don't like seatbelt laws. I think that they're intrusive, and I think they're an improper use of the force of the state to, basically threaten me if I don't wear my seatbelt, there's going to be a ticket and a fine and enforcement behind it. But one of the most effective things that I've ever seen that made me want to wear a seatbelt was propaganda. And it was just simply a public service announcement that portrayed a guy pantomiming like he's driving a car, and he's sitting in his living room and his wife and daughter are just looking at him lovingly as he's pantomiming like he's driving a car. And in slow motion, he pretends that he is getting into a wreck. And it's very, very well done. I mean, he kicks the table, dishes go flying, and it's clear he is in danger. And at that point, his wife and his daughter rush over to him and encircle him in their arms as if they were the safety belts. And they restrain him from harm. And the commercial ends with, wear your seatbelt because there are people who love you who would miss you if you were injured. And I was like, bam, right in the feels. Holy cow. That made me want to wear my seatbelt. Way more than, the idea of the cop with the sunglasses and click it or ticket, brother. And so there is good propaganda and there's not so good propaganda. But the bottom line is there is a very clear industry and field of study and application that goes about manipulating and shaping how the public views various issues. And what that does is Edward Bernays wrote about it in a very clinical and detached kind of way of, it's the unseen force behind government and helping people believe a particular narrative, which at its heart is simply a story. What's the story that they want us to believe? I'm sorry. But those who are in power is the they that I'm referring to. What would those in power want us to believe? And so what we have to do, the thing that's incumbent on us, is to become effective sorters of fact from fiction. Both of you, I'm looking at Steve's bookshelf there and trying to determine, do I see the great books of Western civilization anywhere on there? It's hard to tell, but...
I've got, yeah, there's a couple.
Okay, I'm not to put you on the spot, but the preface to the great books of Western civilization, which was compiled at the University of Chicago back in 1952 by Mortimer Adler and Robert Hutchins and a whole slew of people. I think it was like 400,000 man-hours of effort that went into compiling those works. And when they published them with a little book at the very beginning called The Great Conversation. And I believe it was Robert Hutchins who wrote that Great Conversation. And he explained, why would we spend all this time, all this effort, and it was quite a sum of money. I mean, it was, $1 million+ in 1952. That was a chunk of change to put together these great classics of Western civilization. And the concern that they expressed nearly 70 years ago was that there was a blizzard of information swirling around people all day, and their concern was that people were losing their ability to think effectively. And the difference between, winning on Jeopardy, like what's his name, Ken Jensen, going on and on, for $1 million on Jeopardy, versus being able to think clearly is you don't have to have all the answers at the tip of your tongue. You simply need to know what questions need to be asked to get a better understanding of the situation at hand. And they recommended the great books of Western civilization, those classic canonized pieces of literature, poetry, math, science, and so forth, as ways that people could better inform their thinking, better order their thinking, and in essence, propaganda-proof themselves. The word they used was bamboozle. We don't want to see people being bamboozled by all that information. And so Robert Hutchins and Mortimer Adler, to that end, undertook this project, and it became the Great Books of Western Civilization. So I'm going to suggest to you that if we're very serious about understanding the world around us, we have to be willing to do, as you pointed out, Steve, homework. It was your own effort that found this individual who had written this article that you had in question. It was your initiative to go after him and ask him questions. Hey, could I get some more information? And it paid off. There are way too many people, and myself included at times, who want to sit back and be spoon-fed. Well, what does it all mean? And we're afraid that we can't think like experts. In fact, we've adopted this belief that truth is something that is handed down to us by someone in authority. That's not the way to find truth. The way to find truth is to become a person who can think in a more well-rounded way and who can ask the right questions to get that better understanding. So let there be innumerable sources. And this is kind of going to your question, David. Will those ad hoc, the decentralized platforms for information, are they susceptible to the same temptations? Absolutely. And I say that in the sense that you'll notice as they become more popular, they tend to become more commercialized, because a person can make a pretty decent living, provided they don't get deplatformed or demonetized by YouTube or some of these other social media platforms. And with that comes the temptation to start serving the god of more. Well, I need more money, which means I need more exposure. I need more clicks. And they get more sensational and sometimes lose sight of what brought them into that position in the first place. And so these hosts become a caricature of themselves. And I'm going to name a name here, Alex Jones. I don't know what your reaction is, both of you, when you hear his name, but Alex Jones actually got a lot of things right. But in order to stay in front of the pack, he had to become more and more sensational, to the point that people finally were just like, whoa, I don't know if I can take this guy serious any longer. So that's my initial long-winded answer to both of your fundamental questions, and I'd be happy to hear your take on it.
What about the consequence of the more sources that we develop, which I tend to agree with you. I mean, it seems self-evident that you would want more sources of information, more independence, even more myopia to some degree, because then you can go and find somebody who's talking specifically about some particular, subject that you have interest in or that you have concern over. But when the Challenger blew up in 1986, I was 11 or 12 years old, and I remember driving in my mom's station wagon up in Canada, snow-covered streets, and we were navigating, and the voice came over the radio and talked about the Space Shuttle Challenger has just, exploded on, 30 seconds into its flight, and just how that was the talk of everything for weeks. And then the hearings that happened, and eventually figured out that it was the O-ring, and you compare that to 9/11. The first couple days were just chaos, obviously, after the towers went down and the attacks happened, and so there was. I mean, to me, that was some of the most honest journalism, because no one had any idea what was going on, and all they could do was stand there looking at what's going on and describe it to the best of their ability. But within weeks, or months, certainly, there was all kinds of conspiracy theories started. The internet was, it's 2001, so they were 5-6 years into the internet, and the conspiracy and the misinformation and opposing information just starts to go rampant, and then fast forward another 20 years of internet development and sources of information. And now here we are with the United States presidential election. And it's like, I think most people would say, I've tried to dip my toe in the water. I've tried to do some research. I've read some articles. I just don't really, the more I read, the less I feel like I know what to think. As I was thinking today about this conversation we would have with you, the thing popped into my mind, the saying, if you don't stand for something, you'll fall for anything. And it's like we've become, I think, as a society, very adept at criticizing and being fundamentally, the word escapes me, suspicious of everything that we hear, which is interesting because I feel like the susceptibility to really stuff that should be hogwash on its face, people believe it. Like, you'll have one person go, well, I don't believe anything that is said on CNN because they're crazy. And then they'll start talking about what they heard on Fox, which to them is, crystal clear truth. And I'm like, that sounds just as crazy and just as out there as what you're describing on the other side. And so if you're not, and maybe that's the answer to the question, like you said, having that internal compass, but is it more work? Is it more work in 2020 than it was in 1960 or 1980 or 2000 to I guess, calibrate that compass?
The volume of information that's being broadcast at us certainly has increased. I found it interesting 70 years ago. They were using the term blizzard of information. I'm thinking, what? They had telephones, they had newspapers, and radio. TV was still in its infancy. So it surprised me to see them use those words. But yeah, there's a lot of information coming at us. And at the same time, there's a lot of what's called ephemera, which is inconsequential little details, the Daily Tattler. Ooh, did you hear what so-and-so wore to this award show? There's a lot of stuff that can take up our time that really doesn't have any value. So one of the things that we have to decide as individuals is what adds value to my life and what doesn't. And maybe I'll upset some people when I say this, but I don't follow political news very closely. In fact, there's a lot of political stuff going on that I'm like, interesting, but I don't really care to know about it because it doesn't have any direct impact on me. And I'm always willing to delve in and to explore and discover, things that I think actually have impact on my life. But there's also, to me, a sense that our major media, our mass media, has become fear delivery systems. And it helps politicians who play on that fear in order to attain power. Like after 9/11, well, we need to pass this Patriot Act. We need to do this. Don't think about it. And people don't understand that Patriot Act, or at least many of the provisions of that Patriot Act had been sitting on the table, waiting for some event that had the emotional leverage to come along where a politician could step up and say, see, we need this. And I think that the rush with which it was passed has been very harmful overall to a lot of our freedoms that we took for granted up to that point. And so politicians will take advantage of fear. News media and mass media, including entertainment and movies and so forth, play upon our fears, because the two strongest emotions to get us to click on a story, at least online, are either anger or fear. And look at the tabloid type approach that so many, including Fox News, including CNN, they gaslight us on a regular basis. They will tell us to our faces, this is true, when it's not true. And so I have trust issues with the heritage media. And I actually think that's a good thing. I've chosen largely to unplug from it simply because it doesn't add that much value to my life. If there's something interesting that comes along, I'm going to go dig and see what I can find out about it. But as for the rest, I'm okay with unplugging from that portion of the matrix and focusing on those areas of my life where there's something more meaningful, something where I actually can use my influence, however big or small it may be, in a consequential manner.
I want to pick up on this. There's a brief story to share with you, Brian. Steve, I don't know if you follow Canadian news these days, but something interesting happened the other day. So, Brian, you just said that they being CNN or I forget, Fox were your two examples, but they will tell you something straight to your face knowing that it's absolutely false. Now, 2 or 3 days ago here in Canada, the Prime Minister, Justin Trudeau, wanted to hold a meeting with the leader of the opposition, Erin O'Toole, and he wanted to essentially scold Erin O'Toole because there were members of Parliament in the Conservative Party that the Liberal Party thought felt that they were spreading misinformation, when in fact the Member of Parliament was simply quoting a journalist who was quoting data published by the province of Alberta regarding COVID statistics. So here are these statistics. The journalist said, here are the statistics. The MP said, those are the statistics. And then the Liberal Party said, that's misinformation. And the Justin Trudeau wanted to have this meeting and scold Erin O'Toole to say, hey, you've got to keep your MPs in line. But what happened was a press release was published from the Prime Minister's office saying, Justin Trudeau has just met with Erin O'Toole and they talked about misinformation in the media and blah, blah, blah. The meeting had not yet happened. Erin O'Toole, when this message was published, Erin O'Toole was still sitting in a meeting with his caucus, and how ironic can you get, right? The scolding about misinformation was released as a press release, which was totally misinformation. I want to pick up on something that you said here, Brian. You so state broadcast or state funded broadcaster bad. Okay, Steve, are you content with that response? Do you want to dig into that? Because I can attest to that.
I think Brian made his stance clear on that, and I would probably tend to agree. Yeah.
So we're seeing in Canada the total abuse of the state broadcaster right now, which is by every measure very left-leaning and very supportive of the current government, which happens to be liberal. The state broadcaster, even when there's a conservative government, the state broadcaster is primarily liberal. It tends to be the Liberal Party that continues the funding for this organization, and the conservative members tend to want to retract some of those programs and reduce some of the funding. And so it's literally a fight for their existence, and so they support the party that pays them. But I wonder, and if you could elaborate more on this isn't really a question, Brian, but I wonder if with more voices and independent voices, it perhaps becomes harder for, as you say, the powers that be to choose and shape the narrative, to restrict the narrative. Because I have access to alternate voices, while simultaneously it becomes harder and harder for us to propaganda-proof ourselves. I like that phrase, right? That's your phrase, propaganda-proof. Yeah, back to you. There's no question there.
Okay.
Yeah.
I would maintain, and this is from personal experience, that the more you practice critical thinking and honing your ability to seek truth amidst fiction and fluff and ephemera, the better you become at it. And I'm not saying this to brag. It's not like I have all the answers, but I find my BS detector has become much more calibrated over the years. And that doesn't mean that I'm going to automatically reject anything that I would see on CNN or even on Fox News for that matter, even though I largely don't have use for them. I've just simply learned that there are better places where I can go. News aggregators, for instance, AIER.org, you mentioned, is one of those, the American Institute for Economic Research. And I always have to take, when we're dealing with human beings, when we're dealing with any issue, there was an old columnist for the Orlando Sentinel, Charlie Reese, and he said, before we get too cocky, thinking that we know all about a given subject or a person or an event, he says, ask yourself this question: what do I know about this that wasn't told to me by someone else? And if we're honest with ourselves, more often than not, we have to admit, not much. And so there's a degree of humility that comes along with that truth seeking. I keep an open mind, but there are some things that I would say over the years I have either researched or discussed or debated or explained well enough that I'm fairly comfortable in making a commitment to the truth as I understand it. I'm also open to more truth as it becomes available. And like John Milton, back when he was writing to the King of England in Areopagitica, he was begging, don't pass these laws against freedom of speech, because he said, and I'm paraphrasing, whoever knew truth to come out the worse, for an encounter with falsehood. Let truth and falsehood wrestle. And I tend to believe the same thing. More voices speaking truth, even if they don't get it entirely right, I think give us the better opportunity to have a clearer picture of what's going on. And I'm really convinced that in the free market of ideas, the best ones will rise to the top by virtue of competition.
One thing, it's a pretty basic conservative principle that you concentrate on how you're being governed locally much more than you concentrate on, state, provincially, federally. And one thing struck me that you said, I just don't care about the national political news that much. And maybe that's part of the antidote. Maybe that's part of the solution. We get enough people not caring, then if there's no clicks, if there's no customers, so to speak, for that national narrative directing type media, and we're all kind of ensconced mostly in, what's going on in our own backyards, in our own families, in our own communities, then maybe the federal government takes the seat that it's supposed to, in the original founding, and we start to actually limit it. But I guess that's a good question. The ends are not often don't necessarily justify the means, but yeah. How do we change? How do we right the ship? How do we get some real movement towards limited government, towards some of those, foundational principles, when, boy, it seems overwhelming to get on social media, to even go out in the world, go out in your neighborhood and start talking to people. It's like, so much indoctrination has happened from certain media sources, this way, that way, whatever way, and it's hard to even have these types of conversations.
I'm going to just put my cards on the table for you, Steve. Politics is poison. It poisons and taints everything that it touches. And it's the only thing I can think of, the only technology, if you will, that's been around for 5,000 years that has not shown some type of improvement. It still comes down to who will use force against whom, who is going to get to tell others what to do. And so it turns any issue that becomes politicized into a power struggle. And that's one of the reasons why I personally choose to limit my participation in politics. I haven't totally stepped away from it, but I don't give it a great deal of time. And I want to contrast that with the way that the mass media, particularly in America, I assume it works this way in most of the rest of the first world, treats politics as if this is the most important thing going on. All you have to do is look at the lead story for any day on this national news channel or that national news channel, whatever they're leading off with for the hour, and 9 times out of 10, it's going to be, well, the president is doing this, or this is what's happening, and it's some political intrigue. And by the fact that it's the top story, and they have a correspondent right there in the halls of Congress or right there in the White House telling us what's going on, is supposed to convey to us that there's nothing in the world more important than this. But in reality, if you look at it from a certain angle, it's just so much melodrama. It's professional wrestling with better costumes, and it's being played out as if this is the most important thing. I submit it's only as important as we give it credibility to be important.
On the same day, somebody might have invented something amazing. Somebody might have saved someone's life. Somebody might have, created an economic engine, a business, which at the end of the day, in retrospect, could be so much more important than whatever flavor of the minute news story that was about. That makes sense to me.
I'll give you an example too, and this is just a personal example. I spent very little time over this past weekend worrying about the outcome of the challenge to the election. Is Biden going to become president? Is Trump going to retain the office for another term? I spent very little time thinking about that. And part of that has to do with the fact that I was contacted by 2 very close friends, each of whom their spouses had just received a diagnosis of cancer. Now, I promise you, there was nothing in the world more important to these friends over these past few days, and actually for their foreseeable future, than the well-being of their spouse. Nothing is going to come close. And so rather than me sitting there wringing my hands over, is Trump's challenge going to hold up in court or anything like that? I'm much more concerned with how can I be a friend? How can I support them? Because that's someplace where I know my impact can be felt in a way that actually makes a difference. All my fretting and, maybe going and waving a flag or something, it might help some people feel better, but I don't necessarily know that it will have the same measurable impact for good that being a friend to these people would have. Does that make sense?
Yeah, I think it makes a lot of sense. Intuitively, you might say, well, but me being a good person to my family and to my neighbors, how exactly does that fulfill my responsibility to be a good citizen, and to be an informed voter? I guess would be the most fundamental way to put it. Like when I go to cast my ballot, don't I need to watch all of that? Don't I need to know about Giuliani's spray tan dripping down or something? Isn't that part of what needs to inform me as a responsible citizen?
That's the key, though, and you said it. It's part. It's one facet of a very multifaceted existence, but because of the I think hyper attention that is paid to it, primarily through mass media and through just politicizing things and the tribalism that comes along with that, we tend to overemphasize it at the expense of other areas where our influence, it might be small, it may be unnoticed. Nobody's writing newspaper articles about who was taking care of grandma this weekend, but it still makes a difference. And I'm convinced that, I've said many times, the essence of leadership is how you use your influence right where you are standing. And I think that some of the most important uses of that influence fall outside of that political realm.
That reminds me of the conversation we had last week, David, where I kind of I thought, once you get a political office, all of a sudden it's like your intentions flip, and all of a sudden it's like, well, I know that I should be using my influence in my sphere to represent the people that elected me, but somehow that can morph pretty quickly and corrupt, like David mentioned, into an idea of, well, now I can pull levers in society. I can apply pressure and provide incentives and disincentives and multiply my influence, and now cause, thousands or millions of people to act the way that I've discovered is the right way. And I guess if I'm hearing you right, Bryan, there is no escaping that. Politics has been that from the beginning and will continue to be that. And so what is the antidote to politics? What is the label that we put on that? Is it liberty? Is it religion? Is it economics?
Responsibility. Don't outsource to authority what could be handled at a lower level. And this could take in so many different aspects of life. I think we probably would. I would hope we share a common belief that the purpose for which government exists is to protect our natural rights, to ensure that they are not violated. And if someone does victimize us, hurts us or our property, we have some kind of recourse to be made whole, and they can be held accountable. But when it becomes an instrument for social engineering, there's just no end to the mischief that can ensue. So keeping government limited and keeping the solutions as close to the people who are actually affected by whatever the issue may be is essential. And we forget sometimes, in the United States particularly, prior to 1913, do you realize that there was no direct income tax except for a very brief time during the American Civil War, and it was repealed? Actually, it was struck down by the Supreme Court almost immediately following the end of hostilities. But in that time, roads were built, bridges were built, museums, hospitals, parks, and it was done through philanthropic efforts on the part of private citizens who were in the process of building one of the greatest economic engines that history has ever seen as they moved westward, as they settled and tamed the land and used the resources. But it didn't happen because government was so big and so powerful and so centrally planned that it said, you take this money and you take this money and we'll go and do this and this and this. So that to me is the most overlooked success story, at least in American history. And yet most Americans don't know it, and they still believe, well, without government, taking my money and giving it to the poor, why the people would be going hungry. Well, how did they solve that issue, before the current welfare state? It was solved at the community level.
This is an interesting anecdote. So David and I actually attended school from kindergarten clear till 12th grade together, and this little kind of small town or city, about 150,000 people in Saskatchewan, Canada. And I remember as a young boy going to the library and walking in one day and just, what is this plaque? And the plaque explaining that the Rockefellers built the library in this little town in Saskatchewan, Canada, of 150,000 people. That library was provided by the Rockefellers, an ultra-rich family, the Bezos of that time. And it's interesting because you're right. A lot of good work was done without an income tax, without a large, oppressive, centralized government.
So because
yes.
we grew up in Saskatchewan, and I've I think had a very interesting political shift in my own philosophies, and so I still don't know where I land on this particular issue of income taxes or taxes in general. I think some tax is really useful. So, for example, in Saskatchewan, when my grandfather was middle age, that's around the time that Tommy Douglas was premier of the province, and used the revenues from taxes to provide electricity throughout the entire province, to even rural communities that otherwise wouldn't receive electricity probably for many, many decades later if it were left to, or at least this is the thought, if it were left to philanthropy. Roads were built, hospitals were erected, public school was paid for. I agree that those amenities are useful in a society, and I'm willing to help pay for those, provided that their mandates are very, like the institution of public school. I've been happy to pay my property taxes for all my life and pay into that system until more recently I realized actually public school has become a kind of church for many social justice issues, and not all of those are things that I agree are important to invest in. That's a different conversation, but maybe we can just say some of that activism I don't agree with activism in public schools. I agree with education in public schools, and maybe that's actually the better distinction to make. It's not an issue of social justice versus other. It's an issue of how are we investing this money in education or in activism. So taxation with representation makes good sense to me. I'm willing to pay that, and I'm not sure that, like your example, Brian, of so many great things were built and constructed and provided prior to the creation of an income tax, but also around that time, there was basically an elite rich class and then a massive proportion of proletariat, and there was a middle class that rose up, in the middle of the 20th century. That could then help pay for many of these infrastructure and institutional, these institutions within society.
And what was it that made that middle class viable? I can think of the Industrial Revolution as well as the free market. Yeah. That's what raised the standard of living for more people in a shorter amount of time. And the ability to own property, the fact that for so many years, if you worked on a farm, it's that you were literally working for room and board on someone else's farm, and you might get a very, very small wage, but I don't even know what percentage of citizens in the New World, and for how many years, weren't even legally allowed to purchase property, and it was a significant percentage of people. Once those laws changed so that we could actually own property and develop capital, and that wasn't constrained to just the elite class, then the middle class thrived, it seems. That's when child labor went away too.
Yeah.
I mean, the official child labor laws, I believe, came on the books sometime about the 1930s. But child labor was a fact of life for many, many families, simply because they needed every able body possible out there hustling to try to make enough to feed the family. And as the market expanded with opportunities, with jobs, with factories, people going from that agrarian lifestyle to more of an urban or suburban lifestyle, the laws were largely not necessary at that time because the percentage of people that had children who were actually going to work was less than single digit. I mean, it was tiny by that point. But I look to the free market as the way to solve most of those problems. And that's not to say that there isn't a legitimate use for government. I really believe there is. I think good government is actually a blessing. But unfortunately, it's kind of become a catch-all. So whenever somebody says, we have a problem, and someone says, well, there ought to be a law, I think people should recognize that anytime you bring government into an issue, you're bringing an element of coercion and force along with it. And I want to see those things solved voluntarily. Voluntary charity, to me, is the purest expression of charity. Charity that takes money out of my wallet, the threat of you'll go to jail if you don't let us take this, and then gives it to the poor. It's helping the poor, but it's also giving me a convenient excuse to switch off my conscience because, they're being taken care of, as opposed to really, voluntarily saying, I have a responsibility. I should be helping them, and then choosing to do so.
So let's ask a kind of a rapid fire set of questions here. So volunteerism for like something like a food bank. Do you agree or not?
Yeah, I think absolutely people should be free to voluntarily hold
Volunteer
together those resources and make it happen.
volunteer to help the church operate.
Yeah.
Volunteer to fight fires. So volunteer firefighting is normal in many small towns.
Yep.
Big cities, are we of the same opinion that should be something that we rely on volunteerism?
I think people could make it work. I don't think it necessarily needs central government. Obviously, it is a matter for government now, but I guess I'm just suggesting that in its absence,
so the
it's not
issue
like
of
people would just sit around and watch buildings burn and, oh, what could we do?
Right. So we're conflating two issues. I wonder. One question is how much public service, let's say, public is the wrong word, but how much service ought I rely on others to volunteer to provide in the community versus not, versus pay for with something like taxes. That's actually separate from whether those taxes are going to a government-run organization or a private organization. So, like, public-private partnerships and that sort of thing seem also logical. Like, it doesn't have to be a government-run firefighting service. It could be a privately run firefighting service, but paid for with a single payer. That's separate from volunteerism. And like, I don't really have a question here other than to say, I remember in my past saying things like, we shouldn't rely on volunteerism for X if it's really important for the future of our society. And actually nowadays, I don't know if I would agree to say that anymore. I know I have said such a thing in the past, but I'd love to hear your thoughts. You're certainly, at least as much as I understand libertarian philosophy, let's say, you're further on that spectrum than I, and I'd like to hear your thoughts about it.
Yeah, I'm a big fan of things should be as voluntary as possible. I would say even taxes should be voluntary. If somebody says, look, I want a park for my kids to play in and I'm willing to contribute to that, I wouldn't stand in their way. Well, that's not an appropriate use for your money. No, it's your money. You go ahead and you choose if that's the way you'd like to spend it. If you really want to see where people stand on the issue, here's the holy grail. Suggest to them, maybe we should privatize policing. And that's where you'll see heads start to explode, because they're like, well, how could somebody possibly provide, policing and security for a community? And I once thought that way myself. And then I heard about Dale Brown and his company in Detroit, Michigan, which is not known for being one of the more peaceful communities in America. But they provide free market, customer-based security for their customers, which means they have to be responsive to their customers. They can't go bully their customers and boss them around and look for any excuse to say, gotcha, and fine them and ticket them and threaten them. They have to respond in such a way that they're protecting their property, protecting their businesses, and doing it in a way that doesn't make the customer feel like they are, a servant or something like that. And he's very successful. And, that's one anecdotal incident or one example there, but it can work. And I think that sometimes we put too much reliance in, but the state will approach this with fairness and with everybody's, best interest in mind. I am just skeptical enough of government that government becomes kind of a tool for special interest. And it could be police unions, it could be teachers unions, it could be, public workers unions that once they realize, look, we've got the might of a political organization, they tend to use that to their advantage. And that's human nature. I'm not saying they're evil or they're stupid for doing so. I'm just saying when you have the ability to take, to extract money from the public's pocket via taxes, it's a lot easier to find excuses to spend that money than if you're spending your own.
This goes back to something we talked about a few weeks ago, Steve. Bryan, so your park example is a great one, where I do think that if a community of people got together and they said, we would like a park, people would be willing to pay for that. And Steve, you and I, a few weeks ago, talked about the notion that maybe it should be illegal for governments to run a deficit. And what that does, or what would do, is it would tighten that feedback loop. So that there would have to be a let's say, near-term objectives. Like, we're going to build a park, we're all going to pitch in, because the money doesn't come from trees. So we're all going to pay, and that this budget is going to be balanced and addressed within short order. But when governments can run deficits, then promises can be made to such special interest groups, not just for the park in the nearby neighborhood this year, but infrastructure and various debt instruments that it will last a country for 50 years. Or Canada right now has more debt than it ever has had, and there doesn't seem to be a plan to ever pay it off. But if we can, it's probably within 100 years that we'll be able to pay it off.
We definitely need to have an economist on the show at some point. And there's a lot of great conversations that I'd like to have. Well, Bryan, we're getting close to our time here, and I'd just like to express how much I appreciate you being here. Here's my takeaways from some of the things, new things that I'm going to walk away with after this conversation. One is that I think I was looking for this elegant theory of everything, and perhaps that was the nature of my question. But isn't there somebody who can just tell me how it is, who can just give me the answers, and give everybody the answers, because everybody deserves to know the truth, and maybe what I know, or what I research and what I understand about politics and the economy and news in general, maybe that should be a lot more closely related to the things I'm doing and the things that matter to me and my family and my community. And the second thing that's really related to that is, rather than, if I'm for limited government, maybe most of my strategy or most of my work in that direction needs to be me simply saying to the government, thanks, but I've got this. Yeah. Rather than going and standing on a street corner with a sign saying, you need to get out of my back pocket, and you need to get out of my backyard and go away, and just simply to demonstrate that I can handle this myself. And there's certainly some of the other, because you'll have clashes. They'll say, no, you're not going to handle this. And yes, I am. And, if I want to walk eggs across the street from my chickens to my neighbor and he gives me a few bucks or whatever. And, I think that's the, more of the answer, though, is just worrying about ourselves locally, personally, exercising that liberty maybe as much or more than fighting for it or voicing for it. Does that make sense?
There's a word for what you're describing, and it's agorism, agorism. And all it means is simply reducing your governmental footprint. Don't seek permission for everything that you do. And this is presupposing that your behavior is going to be peaceful. But yeah, you have chickens and your neighbor needs eggs and his wife cuts hair. Hey, what if we were to work out some kind of a trade or a barter here? And, I know the IRS would be sad to hear that they're missing out on a cut of somebody's happiness. But, gee, if it solves your problem and solves their problem, solves your neighbor's problem, well, it seems to me like that's a good way to do things.
Thank you.
Thanks, Steve. I'll summarize a few points I'll take away from this conversation. One is propaganda proof. I like that term. We have to propaganda proof ourselves. Another thing I'll take away is something you said. Okay, so to my earlier fundamental question is that I do think that the media personalities, whether it's from a large conventional broadcast network or if it's a small time, amateur at Parler or YouTube or wherever, the tendency toward corruption is high. And because what was your phrase? People become addicted to more, or I forget how you said that. But the difference, perhaps, though, between sort of some big centralized media outlets versus many independent, decentralized, is that, like fruit flies, these will rapidly spin up and then either spiral out of control toward total corruption or fizzle out because they weren't successful. But this will evolve more rapidly than these other centralized things. I'm going to take that away from our conversation. I don't know if you said that specifically, but it resonated with me throughout our conversation.
Yeah.
I'd also appreciate that you've been here, and maybe we'll pick up this conversation again in the future. Do you want to leave us with some thoughts and some final words, or do you want to ask us some questions, or
I just want to thank the two of you.
I don't have anywhere to be at this point. We could carry on if you want.
I actually, my family just came home, and I work from home, which is one of the blessings of one of those small decentralized operations.
Yeah.
But I just want to express my appreciation to the two of you for having me on your show. I love that you're having these kinds of conversations. And if I can be of any service to you, including if I can hook you up with an economist or with other people who might, be able to contribute to these types of conversations, please ask. I think the more voices that are speaking truth from whatever platform it may be, and when I say speaking truth to the best of our ability, with the understanding none of us have cornered the market, I think the better off we're all going to be. People have alternatives, and I think I trust people to make the right decision. I trust them to recognize when something holds true or is sound versus that doesn't sound so good. But I say that because I'm on that journey of slogging my way out of the swamp of misinformation. We're all somewhere on that journey. I think we have a duty to help those who are a little bit further behind us. And I think we have a debt of gratitude towards those people who've left markers along the way to help us find our way out. That's
a great way to put it. That actually resonates with the vision that Steve and I have for this, is that we have a duty. Like we're relatively articulate, we're well read in some respects, we're capable of some lateral thinking, we have diverse opinions. We have a duty, probably, to have conversations and have difficult conversations at times that, as a model for others that struggle to have difficult conversations or that stay away from conversation that might offend or so thanks for articulating it that way. Bryan, it's been really great to have you with us.
Thank you.
Real pleasure. Thank you so much.
So the way this works next is I'm going to take you off screen here, but just do keep in mind that we'll still be able to hear you unless you mute or actually just exit. So if you want to stick around and listen, you're welcome, but we're going to hear noises if you make them.
Okay. Thanks for the warning.
Thanks, Bryan.
Thank you, Bryan. Have a great night.
Steve, there was this word that came up a few times throughout the conversation, this word truth. And it struck me that the three of us, and if I had to guess Bryan's perspective on this, I think the three of us do agree that there is a truth. Like that it might not be possible to perceive it completely because we're limited, but there is such a thing as there isn't, for example, multiple truths. Would you agree, or have I mischaracterized something here?
It's not a popular thing to say that there's relative truth, but I don't know that you can get away from that. I think there is fundamental truth. I think that there's basic truth, and that is different things to different people. For some people, that's their family relationships. For some people, that's a religious ideology. For some people, that may be just the way they live their lives, the way they, purport themselves, et cetera. I mean, but
do we can agree that I'm no scientist, but I've never floated away from this planet. I think gravity and what I've learned about gravity is probably real, and it's true that gravity exists. Maybe we don't understand completely how it works, but I've never seen you float away from the planet either, and I think that there's enough common experience that we both think that we're standing on a planet, and that neither of us have the experience of floating away from the planet. So, like, to some degree, there's some objective reality, and so I don't know what you meant by basic or fundamental truth, but back to you.
Yeah, I think you can keep digging and picking at that scab until you get into a mess. I mean, even with something as fundamental or basic as gravity, like you say, we don't understand perfectly the mechanisms, the scientific mechanisms that make that work, which means ultimately we may find that what we think is just perfect fact is actually just a uniformity of the way that gravity works in this particular corner of our universe or something. And if you go down the street to, maybe it acts differently, and with one opposing viewpoint or one opposing perspective, all of a sudden it's like, oh, gravity's a spectrum now, and it works, time, same thing. But I think more importantly for our podcast and the kind of conversations we're having, and I think, we kind of drilled into this a little bit with Bryan, is socially, politically, economically, that's where it is very muddy right now. There's so many voices, well-intentioned voices, trying to push the truth out to people that that it's extremely difficult to try and ascertain this is a fact about those types of things. They're so wishy-washy in so many ways, and so like what Bryan was talking about, just focus in your own backyard. What are you worried about? What are you doing? What concerns you or your own or your family's welfare? And how are you being charitable to yourself, your family, your community, and work out from there? Like he says, whatever influence you have, wherever you are, that's what and where you exercise that influence. And if you do that, it's kind of a natural corollary that if you focus locally, your influence will grow. What you focus on will tend to develop and to bloom. And so,
it's really hard for us to figure out what is true when there are seemingly authoritative voices, multiple authoritative voices that are presenting very different versions of reality.
Like as I thought through that process,
like the election process, like the 2020 election right now, this is a mess, and it's, well, how can a citizen possibly know who is actually the president-elect right now? There's no way to discern that, because no one has access to the facts. The facts presented are very disparate and incoherent. This is dangerous territory. But back to the comment, like the part of the reason we wanted to talk with Bryan is to figure out whether citizens have a role to play as broadcasters of their own views and their own experiences and the facts that they can investigate and share, to sort out all of that mud and make it less muddy for people. But the other reality is that people will corrupt those. Not every motive is equal, let's say, in its altruism, and so some people are going to use modern media for profit, and others are going to use it for infamy, and some are going to use it for how to navigate this. And I worry for people coming up in. I was going to mention earlier, this is kind of funny. I remember back in, I know maybe you participated in this little program too, but during school, maybe grade 7 or 6, I remember being like invited out of the normal classroom for like a few days, maybe in sequence, and I was taken with maybe 15 other students from my grade, and maybe you were one of them, and we were taken to a kind of library setting or whatever, and we were taught how to read a newspaper, like how does this format work, and the table of contents, and how to navigate it from the page to page, and what are each of the sections. It was like literally a little section about reading journalists and reading this media and how to navigate it. I worry that kids in school these days are having a real hard time navigating media. I am, and I have 45 years experience.
Yeah, that was the Pegasus program.
Was it?
It was called the Pegasus program. I don't remember the journalism one, but I remember learning about tetrahedrons.
Interesting.
Putting together different geometric shapes. In fact, I was with another student in my mom's car driving on my way to one of those Pegasus programs at the university.
Yeah.
And it was 5th or 6th grade, and that's where I was in the car when I heard about the shuttle Challenger disaster.
Yeah.
But maybe what it comes down to is it just doesn't matter. I cast my vote in the presidential election here in my state. My state is going to take those votes and put them together. They're going to certify them. I'm in a state that isn't that particularly contentious. There's not really any lawsuits going on, but they're going to certify that vote, and then they're going to compile those, and whoever is deemed the winner at that point is the next president, and that's not really decided till mid-December. Just traditionally, that's been decided on election night because it's been somewhat obvious who's going to end up with what electoral votes. But there's a process in place, and maybe I don't need to care that much. Maybe I would be better, maybe my time would be better served at a city council meeting here in my own city, talking about what they're going to do with a particular piece of land that I have to drive by, or that my children are going to grow up dealing with the consequences of potentially. Or, like Bryan said, helping a couple of neighbors who's received some difficult diagnosis and really need some significant help for their family. Maybe that's where my time needs to be. And I think that's true. And then it's just about balancing those different issues and trying to find your own truth. One thing that I thought of is, well, if we all did that, then we're going to end up with some echo chambers, because there's a lot of people around here who tend to think the same way. Mm-hmm. And isn't that going to create, us self-reinforcing? And don't we need some of that national media? Don't we need a person like a representative of a Black Lives Matter, or somebody that's kind of far afield, maybe from what we're used to politically or racially, whatever, to come into our community and splash a little bit of outsideness? I don't know. I don't know what the correct balance is, but I think we need to, with our, in my opinion, in our podcast, let's start talking to some people that we really maybe don't agree with, that will really challenge some of the ways that we look at things, and so that we can be challenged. That's one of the more important things that we're trying to do here is we want to challenge ourselves to be able to listen to those people and to have great conversations and to have respect for them, true respect, like legitimate, fundamental respect for those people, and walk away saying, I don't agree with all of their viewpoints, but I sure like that person. Because that would prove, one of my hopes for this world is that everybody does have good intentions generally.
Well, we had a great conversation with your sister, with whom you disagree on a lot.
A lot of things, yeah.
However, there was at least a mutual desire, well, a respect over many years, but a mutual desire also to find common ground, and you are siblings after all. And so I agree to find other folks that don't have that same starting place that we also might fundamentally disagree with. I mean, a lot of people come to mind, but forming those invitations in a way that would feel genuine and and respectful is difficult. Like, for example, if I go out and just invite so and so, a name is coming to mind right now, but I won't say it out loud. But if I were to go invite her, she might receive the invitation in a very defensive manner, just because we've had some difficult interaction already online, and like, I'd love to go and say, hey, we've had this difficult interaction. Wouldn't it be great to have a conversation? Would you be willing to come on to and have this conversation with us? I'm not sure that invitation would be received as I intend for it to be received. It'd be difficult.
Well, I think that's good, having the both of us too. I know that was a big part of the dynamic when we had the connection conversation with my sister, was having you there and just having that third party. I think
that's an interesting point.
In fact, my political and my socioeconomic respect for my sister's opinions actually elevated a lot during that conversation, because I'm like, wow, she's really well spoken, really eloquent about her ideas, and I have great respect for that, even though I disagree with some of it. And
but I wonder if there's actual research about this, the power of three, let's say, in a
geometrically, three is, triangle is the strongest structure.
Well, the tetrahedron is,
yes,
which is a fourth vertices, but or so says Buckminster. Anyways, that's an interesting point. I think having three people enter a conversation with good intentions and a willingness to find some common ground is, I wonder, is that empirically more successful than two, which in my experience can quite easily become combative. There isn't a third voice for, as a mediator, maybe. Interesting. Maybe it's a different skill. To have a really hard conversation with just two people requires perhaps more patience and skill than with three.
Vis-a-vis marriage.
Vis-a-vis marriage, yeah. So maybe three isn't a crowd always. It's interesting.
Well, I think it must be about time to end the stream. Our viewership's starting to dwindle.
That's okay.
So that's our cue,
Well,
thanks
so let's say,
Mom.
yeah. So thanks for watching. I hate to say this. I'm going to just be completely honest, though. I do this selfishly so I can have interesting conversations with Steve and with our guests, and I hope that others enjoy it. But even if you don't enjoy it, we're going to continue. I hope. I certainly will. But
it's a great experience for me. I feel the same.
So, but if you do enjoy it, really, fundamentalfreedoms.locals.com is a place where we've signed up and we upload our videos there, and I'm busy. I have lots to do in my life, and I get into trouble if I carry on too much conversation at Facebook. So fundamentalfreedoms.locals.com is a place where hopefully some of that conversation is better moderated, easier to maintain some dialogue on an ongoing basis without it just without Godwin's law taking over. And also like and subscribe, and you'll be notified when we go live next.
Appreciate your watching tonight, and had a great conversation. Thank you, David, and we will look forward to having the next one.
Excellent. Have a great evening.